A 72-year-old black man lies face down on hot asphalt, hands zip-tied behind his back, blood trickling from his temple. A white officer's knee presses into his spine. "Whose car did you steal, old man?" The cop snarls. The elderly man stays silent because he knows something the officer doesn't. He's Justice Elijah Johnson, Supreme Court judge. But today he chooses to be invisible. Today he becomes every black man who never had the power to fight back. The late afternoon sun hung low over Millfield, Pennsylvania, casting golden light through the maple trees that lined Riverside Drive. It was the kind of peaceful autumn day that made you believe in the goodness of small-town America. Porch swings creaking in the breeze, kids riding bikes past white picket fences, the smell of someone's apple pie cooling on a windowsill. Justice Elijah Johnson had both hands on the wheel of his midnight blue Mercedes S-Class, driving exactly 28 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. After 40 years on the bench, 12 of them on the highest court in the land, caution had become his second nature. But so had something else. A bone-deep weariness that came from always having to be twice as careful, twice as dignified, twice as beyond reproach. He was almost home. Almost to the house where his mother had raised him and his 3 siblings in a neighborhood that used to welcome black families before white flight turned it into exactly the kind of place where a 72-year-old black man driving a luxury car would draw suspicious eyes. The sirens started as a distant wail, then grew louder. Elijah checked his rearview mirror. Red and blue lights exploded behind him, aggressive and immediate. His heart rate didn't spike. It never did anymore. This wasn't his first time. Over 7 decades of living while black in America, he'd been pulled over 43 times. He'd counted. 14 times he'd been driving his own car. 29 times he'd been a passenger. Never once had he been speeding. Never once had he committed a violation. He'd been a federal prosecutor, a circuit court judge, and now a Supreme Court justice. And still, the lights came for him. Elijah flipped on his turn signal, though he was already on the shoulder, and brought the Mercedes to a gentle stop. He placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, visible non-threatening. He'd taught his son these movements when Marcus turned 16. He'd learned them from his own father. The choreography of survival, passed down like a grim inheritance. In his mirror, he watched Officer Ryan Sullivan exit the patrol car. Sullivan was young, maybe 30, with the kind of swagger that comes from a gun and a badge, and never having faced real consequences. His hand rested on his service weapon as he approached his jaw. Set his eyes hidden behind mirrored aviators that reflected Elijah's face back at him, distorted and small. "License and registration," Sullivan barked before he even reached the window. No good afternoon. No, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Just a command delivered like Elijah was already guilty of something. "Of course, officer." Elijah's voice was measured calm, the same voice that had delivered Supreme Court opinions on constitutional law. "I'm going to reach into my glove compartment now for my registration, and then my wallet for my license. I'm telling you this so there's no confusion about my movements. Just do it. And keep your hands where I can see them." Elijah moved slowly, deliberately. Every gesture announced. The registration emerged from the glove box, a simple piece of paper that showed the car was registered to Elijah Marcus Johnson, this address, this city. Then his wallet, expensive Italian leather, a gift from his daughter Elena for his 70th birthday. He extended both documents through the window. Sullivan snatched them without looking at Elijah's face. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Something cold settled in Elijah's stomach. This was different. There was an edge to Sullivan's voice, a barely controlled aggression that Elijah had heard before in courtrooms, on news footage, in the last words recorded before a black man stopped breathing. "Officer, I'd be happy to comply, but I'd like to understand. Are you refusing a lawful order?" Sullivan's hand moved to his holster. "Step out of the vehicle." Elijah could have said it then. 3 words. "I'm a judge." 2 more, Supreme Court. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was principle. Or maybe after 72 years of watching black men and women humiliated, brutalized, and killed by people who were supposed to protect them, he wanted to experience it. Really experience it without the shield of his title. How many times had he sat in his chambers reading case files about traffic stops gone wrong? How many times had he parsed the legal language of reasonable suspicion and officer safety while black families buried their sons and daughters? He'd written opinions. He'd dissented eloquently. But he'd never truly known what it felt like to be powerless. Today, he would know. Elijah opened the door and stepped out, his movements slow and controlled. At 6'1", he still carried himself with the dignified posture of a man who'd walked the halls of power. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his face lined with the wisdom of 7 decades. His suit, even on a Saturday, perfectly tailored. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle." Elijah complied. The hood of the Mercedes was still warm from the drive. He spread his hands flat against the metal. "Is this your car?" Sullivan's voice was right behind him now, too close, violating the space that should exist between a police officer and a citizen during a routine stop. "Yes, officer, it is. As you can see from the registration." "I didn't ask you for commentary. I asked you a simple question. Is this your car?" "Yes." "You expect me to believe that—" Sullivan laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "Old man like you driving a $100,000 Mercedes through this neighborhood. You think I'm stupid?" Elijah's fingers pressed harder against the hood. "Stay calm. Stay alive." "Officer, the registration clearly shows—" "Shut up. I'm running your information, and if there's any warrants, any outstanding tickets, anything hinky about this vehicle, you're going to jail. You understand me?" "I understand that you're doing your job, officer, and I'm cooperating fully." Sullivan's hand suddenly grabbed Elijah's shoulder, spinning him around. "You think you're smart, don't you? Talking all proper using your big words. Where'd you steal this car, old man?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. "I didn't steal—" "Bullshit." Sullivan's face was inches from Elijah's now, and the judge could smell coffee and rage on the officer's breath. "Black man your age, dressed up in some thrift store suit, driving a car worth more than your life. You're either a drug dealer or a thief, and I'm going to find out which." Across the street, Elijah noticed movement. A woman in her 40s had stopped on the sidewalk, her phone raised, recording. A teenage boy on a bicycle had pulled over, watching. An elderly white couple had paused their evening walk, their faces uncertain, troubled. Good, Elijah thought. Let them watch. Let them see. "Officer, I'm going to ask you one more time to check my identification. My name is on the registration. My license is valid. I have broken no laws." "You calling me a liar?" Sullivan's voice pitched higher, performing now for an invisible audience, or maybe for the narrative he was already constructing in his head. "You saying I pulled you over for no reason?" "I'm saying I'd like to understand the basis for this stop." "The basis." Sullivan's laugh was cruel. "The basis is you're driving a vehicle that doesn't belong to you in a neighborhood where you don't belong. The basis is I'm a police officer, and when I tell you to do something, you do it. You don't question. You don't talk back. You comply." The woman filming had moved closer, her phone steady, capturing every word. "I am complying," Elijah said quietly. "I have been complying since the moment you pulled me over. Turn around, hands behind your back." "Am I being arrested on what charge?" "Resisting arrest for starters. Failure to comply with a lawful order. And when I search this vehicle, and I will search it, I'm going to add grand theft auto to the list." "Officer Sullivan." Elijah read the name tag on the man's chest, committing it to memory. "You have my license. You have my registration. You can verify in seconds that I own this vehicle. I have committed no crime. You have no probable cause to search, and you certainly have no cause to arrest me." It was the wrong thing to say. Elijah knew it the moment the words left his mouth. You don't lecture a cop who's already decided you're guilty. You don't cite constitutional law to a man who sees the Constitution as something that protects him, not you. Sullivan's face went red. You're a lawyer now. You're going to tell me how to do my job. I'm simply exercising my rights. Your rights. Sullivan grabbed Elijah's arm, twisting it behind his back with sudden vicious force. The judge gasped as pain shot through his shoulder. His left shoulder, the one that had needed surgery 2 years ago, the one that still ached in cold weather. Your rights are what I say they are. Officer, please, my shoulder. The second arm was yanked back, and Elijah heard himself cry out. 72 years old, and a man half his age was manhandling him like a criminal. The plastic zip tie bit into his wrists too tight, cutting off circulation. On the ground. Now. Officer, I'm an elderly man with a heart condition. I'm not resisting. Please. Sullivan kicked the back of Elijah's knee, and the judge went down hard, his kneecaps cracking against the asphalt. The pain was immediate and stunning. More phones were out now, a small crowd gathering on the sidewalk, and Elijah could hear their voices shocked and frightened. Call someone, a woman shouted. This isn't right. Face down, Sullivan commanded, and when Elijah couldn't move fast enough with his hands bound behind him, the officer planted a boot between his shoulder blades and shoved him forward. Elijah's face hit the pavement. His glasses skittered away. Blood filled his mouth where his lip had split against the asphalt. The world went blurry and red. Stay down. Sullivan's knee came down on his back, grinding him into the street. Don't you move. Elijah couldn't have moved if he'd wanted to. The weight on his spine was crushing. Each breath was a struggle. His heart was hammering now, irregular and painful. And he thought about the bottle of nitroglycerin in his jacket pocket, just inches away, but completely unreachable. Please. He whispered the word, scraping out of him. My medication. Heart condition. Inside jacket. Shut up. You don't get to talk. Another voice, younger, uncertain. Ryan, man, maybe we should... Elijah couldn't see the second officer, but he could hear the fear in the young man's voice. A trainee, maybe. Someone who knew this was wrong, but didn't know how to stop it. Back off, Martinez, Sullivan snarled. This suspect is being combative. He's an old man on the ground, he's not... I said back off. The pressure on Elijah's back increased. Black spots swam across his vision. His chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice. This is how it happens, he thought with strange clarity. This is how they kill us. Not with bullets always. Sometimes just with weight and indifference and the certainty that they can. Officer. Elijah forced the words out, each one a battle. Elijah Johnson, Supreme Court Justice, medical emergency, need medication. Sullivan laughed. Actually laughed. Supreme Court Justice and I'm the president. Shut your lying mouth. My wallet. Elijah gasped. Identification, please. Your identification says Elijah Johnson, age 72, from this address. It doesn't say anything about being a judge. Just another fake ID. How much did you pay for that $50, $100? Call the courthouse. Federal Building, Washington. They'll confirm. The knee ground harder into his spine. I'm not calling anybody. You're going to jail for grand theft auto, resisting arrest, and assaulting an officer. I didn't assault anyone. You did when you tensed up and tried to pull away when I restrained you. That's assault on a police officer. That's 5 years minimum. Through the pain and the crushing weight and the blood in his mouth, Elijah understood Sullivan was building a case. Every lie, every false claim was being constructed in real time. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about a cop who'd made a mistake and was now doubling down, tripling down, creating a narrative where he was the hero and Elijah was the threat. You're making a grave mistake, Elijah said, and hated himself for the pleading in his voice. But his heart was screaming now, a sustained note of pain across his chest. Please, check my identification. One phone call, that's all I ask. What you're asking for is special treatment. Think, because you can talk fancy, someone's going to cut you a break. That's not how this works. You're not special. You're not above the law. The irony would have been funny if Elijah weren't dying. Someone call an ambulance. That was the woman filming, her voice high and frightened. He said he has a heart condition. He needs help. Ma'am, step back, Sullivan shouted, but he didn't look up, didn't ease the pressure on Elijah's back. This is a police matter, unless you want to be arrested for interfering. I'm filming everything. You're killing him. I'm subduing a dangerous suspect, the teenage boy on the bike. He's not dangerous. He's an old man. More voices now, the crowd growing. Elijah could hear them through the roaring in his ears, could feel their horror and their helplessness. They were witnessing it, recording it. But none of them could stop it, because who stops a cop? Who steps between a police officer and his prey? Elijah closed his eyes. The asphalt was hot against his cheek, rough and gritty. His blood was spreading in a small pool beneath his face. His heart was a dying drumbeat, erratic and weak. And he thought about his daughter Elena, who would see this video. His son Marcus, who would watch his father humiliated and brutalized. His grandchildren, who would learn that their grandfather, a Supreme Court justice, a man who dedicated his life to the law, had died on a street corner like so many others. But then something shifted. Through the pain and the fear, a different feeling emerged. Not resignation, not defeat, purpose. He'd chosen this. Not the heart attack, not the brutality, but the silence. He'd chosen not to reveal his identity, not to use his power as a shield. Because how many people had that choice? How many black men and women stopped on street corners just like this one could say, "I'm a Supreme Court justice," and watch the officer's face change? None. The answer was none. They bled on the asphalt without titles to save them. They cried out for mothers and medics while cameras rolled and nothing changed. They died, and America watched and expressed shock and outrage and sorrow, and then forgot until the next video surfaced. But this video, this one with a Supreme Court justice face down on the pavement, this one might be different, if he survived. "Sir, you need to let him up." The young officer Martinez had found his courage. "He's not responsive. He might be. He's faking. It's a tactic. Ryan, he's 72 years old. You're going to kill him." Finally the pressure eased. Sullivan's knee lifted from Elijah's back and the judge sucked in a desperate breath. But his hands were still bound, his face still pressed to the street, and his heart was still failing. "Roll him over. Check his pulse." Rough hands flipped Elijah onto his back. The sky above was impossibly blue, cloudless, beautiful. Martinez's young face appeared frightened, his fingers pressing against Elijah's neck. "Pulse is weak, really weak. We need an ambulance now." "Fine, call it in, but he's still under arrest." Sirens in the distance, more patrol cars arriving, drawn by Sullivan's call for backup. Or maybe by the growing crowd, the phones held high, the collective witness to injustice. Elijah tried to speak, but no words came. His lips moved, forming his daughter's name, Elena. Someone needed to call Elena. Someone needed to tell her that her father loved her, that he'd done this on purpose, that his silence had meaning. But the world was fading now, darkness creeping in from the edges. The last thing he heard was Sullivan's voice, defensive and angry. Suspect became combative during a routine traffic stop. He escalated the situation. "He gave me no choice. Everything I did was by the book." And then Elijah Johnson, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, lost consciousness on Riverside Drive in Millfield, Pennsylvania, while a dozen cameras recorded his fall, and the nation's ugliest truth stood over him writing its report. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. By then, the video had been posted to Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. By the time they loaded Elijah's unconscious body into the vehicle, "Elderly black man brutalized by police" was trending nationally. And by the time his heart stopped twice in the ambulance, shocked back to life each time by paramedics who worked with desperate intensity, someone had identified him. A law clerk from D.C., scrolling through her feed, had frozen, stared, zoomed in on the bloodied face. "Oh my God," she'd whispered. "That's Justice Johnson." The name spread like wildfire. Across newsrooms, through government offices, into the White House Situation Room. Justice Elijah Marcus Johnson, one of 9 people entrusted with interpreting the Constitution of the United States, had been brutalized by a small-town cop who thought he'd stolen a car. The irony was not lost on America. Neither was the rage. The first call came at 6:47 p.m. Eastern Time, interrupting Elena Johnson's Saturday evening as she reviewed depositions for a police brutality case in Atlanta. She almost didn't answer unknown number, probably a spam call, but something made her thumb hover over the green button. Some primal instinct, the kind mothers claim they have when their children are in danger. Except Elena was the child, and her father was the one bleeding. "Ms. Johnson, Elena Johnson. Speaking. Who is this?" "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm the attending physician at Millfield Regional Hospital in Pennsylvania. Your father has been admitted to our emergency department." The depositions scattered across Elena's floor as she stood, her body moving, before her mind caught up. What happened? Is he okay? What? He suffered a cardiac event following an altercation with police. He's stable now, but... An altercation with police? Elena's voice cracked. "My father is 72 years old. What kind of altercation?" Dr. Chen's pause was heavy with meaning. "Ms. Johnson, I think you should come immediately. And you should know. There's video. It's already online." Elena was searching before the doctor finished speaking, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. Twitter loaded first, and there it was, pinned at the top of the trending topics, #Justice Johnson. Below it, a video thumbnail that made her stomach drop. Her father, face down on pavement, a white officer's knee in his back. She clicked play with shaking hands. The video was 93 seconds long. It would be the 93 seconds that changed everything. She watched her father, the man who'd taught her to stand tall, to speak truth to power, to never let anyone diminish her dignity, reduced to a broken figure on hot asphalt, begging for his medication, while a cop half his age called him a liar and a thief. She heard the crowd's horrified voices. She saw the blood spreading beneath his face. She watched him lose consciousness, while the officer stood over him, still justifying, still defending, still certain of his righteousness. Elena watched it 3 times, before she realized she was screaming. Her phone was ringing again, and again, and again. The apartment building's fire alarm might as well have been going off for all the noise suddenly erupting around her. She ignored everything, grabbing her go bag, the one she kept packed for emergencies, for late-night calls from clients who'd been arrested for moments when the law became a weapon, and someone needed a shield. She was out the door in 90 seconds, still wearing her Saturday sweats. Her phone pressed to her ear as she navigated Atlanta traffic, with the kind of reckless focus that came from terror. "Marcus, it's me. Have you seen it?" Her brother's voice was thick, choked. "I'm watching it now. Elena, they almost killed him. I know. I'm heading to the airport. Book me on the first flight to Harrisburg or Pittsburgh, whichever's closer to Millfield. I don't care what it costs." "Already done. There's a 9:15 from Atlanta that connects through Charlotte. I'm in Chicago. I can't get there until tomorrow morning, but I'm coming. Call Mom. Tell her what happened, but don't let her watch the video. Not yet. Just tell her Dad's okay and I'm on my way." Elena. "Not now, Marcus. I can't fall apart now." But she was already falling apart. By the time she reached the airport, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. The video had 17 million views. 17 million people had watched her father brutalized. 17 million witnesses, and it had still happened. The flight was a special kind of hell. 2 hours of turbulence and terrible Wi-Fi and strangers recognizing her from the news because of course the news had picked it up already. CNN was running it on a loop. MSNBC had assembled a panel. Fox News was debating whether Justice Johnson had complied adequately with Officer Sullivan's commands, as if compliance was supposed to prevent your constitutional rights from being violated. Elena watched it all on her phone, her fury building with each passing minute. She was a civil rights attorney. She'd spent 15 years fighting cases exactly like this. But those cases had been other people's fathers, other people's sons and daughters and husbands. This was her father. This was personal. And personal made it dangerous. The rental car was waiting at Harrisburg International. She drove 90 miles an hour through the Pennsylvania darkness, her phone on speaker as calls poured in. Colleagues offering help. Reporters demanding statements, and then at 11:43 p.m., a call that made her blood run cold. Ms. Johnson, this is Chief Wade Parker of the Millfield Police Department. I want to assure you that we're conducting a thorough investigation into this afternoon's incident. Incident. Elena's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. Chief Parker, I just watched a video of one of your officers assault my father, deny him medical care, and lie about it while he was dying. That's not an incident. That's attempted murder. Now, Ms. Johnson, let's not be inflammatory. Inflammatory. My father is a Supreme Court justice who was brutalized for the crime of driving while black, and you're worried about inflammatory language. Parker's voice hardened. Your father failed to identify himself. He escalated the situation. Officer Sullivan followed protocol. Protocol. Elena nearly drove off the road. Your protocol includes kneeling on elderly men with heart conditions. Your protocol includes ignoring pleas for medical assistance. Chief Parker, I'm a civil rights attorney and I've seen your protocol send innocent people to the morgue. I understand you're upset, but I'm not upset, Chief. I'm coming for you. I'm coming for your department. I'm coming for every officer who stood by and watched it happen, and I'm going to burn your entire corrupt system to the ground. She hung up before he could respond. Her hands were steady now, her mind clear. Grief and rage had crystallized into something sharper purpose. Millfield Regional Hospital was a small building that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Elena badged her way past security lawyer credentials, opened doors that grief alone couldn't, and found her father's room on the cardiac wing. Dr. Chen met her outside, a slight woman with tired eyes and the kind of competence that came from years of emergency medicine. He's sleeping. We've stabilized him, but Ms. Johnson, his heart. The stress was significant. He arrested twice in the ambulance. If the paramedics hadn't been so skilled. Can I see him? Of course. But there's something you should know. There are police officers outside his room. Chief Parker stationed them there for his protection. But they're making sure he doesn't leave. Elena's jaw clenched. He's under arrest, isn't he? Dr. Chen nodded. Resisting arrest, assault on a police officer. And they're claiming grand theft auto, though that one seems dubious, given the registration clearly shows the vehicle belongs to him. Of course, they're claiming assault. It's the oldest play in the book. Brutalize someone, then charge them with the crime of being brutalized. Elena pushed past the doctor toward the room where two uniformed officers stood guard, like her father was a dangerous criminal instead of a dying old man who'd committed no crime. They started to block her path. Move, she said quietly. Or, I will have you removed from this hospital so fast you'll leave skid marks. Something in her voice made them step aside. The room was dark, except for the glow of monitors. Elijah Johnson lay in the bed, diminished by tubes and wires, his face swollen and bruised, his breathing assisted by oxygen. Elena had never seen her father look old before. He'd always been a force of nature, tall, commanding, indestructible. The man in this bed looked fragile. She pulled a chair to his bedside and took his hand, careful of the IV line. Hi, Daddy, she whispered. I'm here. You're going to be okay. His eyes opened unfocused at first, then clearing as he recognized her. Elena. His voice was a rasp damaged from the pressure on his throat. You shouldn't have come. You have the Miller case. The Miller case can wait. You can't. She squeezed his hand gently. What were you thinking? Why didn't you tell him who you were? Elijah's eyes closed. Because they don't get to tell. All the others who've been stopped, brutalized, killed, they don't get to flash a Supreme Court badge and walk away. I wanted to know. I needed to know what it felt like to have no power, no protection, no privilege. Just black and vulnerable, and at the mercy of a man with a gun. You almost died learning that lesson. But I didn't die. His eyes opened again, and despite the pain and the machines and the horror of the past 6 hours, there was something fierce in his gaze. And now we have it. All of it. On video. A Supreme Court justice treated exactly like countless others. They can't dismiss it. They can't ignore it. They can't say it's just one bad apple or a misunderstanding or that the victim should have complied better. Elena felt tears on her cheeks. Daddy, they're charging you with assault. With car theft. They're building a case against you. Let them. Elijah's grip tightened on her hand. We'll tear it apart in court. And while we do, we'll expose everything. The system that trained Sullivan. The culture that emboldened him. The network that protects officers like him from accountability. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young black woman in a rumpled suit stepped in, her press credentials visible on a lanyard. Justice Johnson? I'm sorry to intrude. I'm Keisha Williams from the Washington Post. I was hoping... No comment, Elena said sharply. My father needs rest. I understand, but there's something you need to know. I've been investigating the Millfield Police Department for 6 months. There's a pattern here. Officer Sullivan has 17 complaints against him, all involving Black and Latino citizens. None have resulted in discipline. And there's an organization they call themselves the Brave Police Coalition that's been providing legal defense and political cover for officers like Sullivan across the state. Elena's attention sharpened. The BPC. You've heard of them. I've been fighting them for 3 years. They're a network of police unions and private donors who shield bad cops from consequences. But I've never been able to prove the connection to specific departments. Keisha pulled out a folder thick with documents. I can prove it. The Millfield Department receives funding from BPC. In exchange, they employ officers that other departments have fired. Sullivan came from Pittsburgh PD. They let him go after a brutality complaint, and Millfield hired him 2 weeks later. Same story with 6 other officers in this department. Elijah sat up slightly, ignoring the monitors that beeped in protest. How deep does this go? Beyond Millfield, I've tracked BPC funding to departments in 12 states, and there are connections to white nationalist groups, militia organizations that see police departments as recruiting grounds. Justice Johnson, what happened to you today wasn't random. It was systemic. The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of heart monitors. Elena felt the pieces clicking into place, the pattern emerging from the chaos. This wasn't just about one racist cop. It was about an infrastructure of hate, a network designed to protect officers who saw their badge as permission to brutalize. I want everything you have, Elena said. Every document, every connection, every name. I'll send it all. But Ms. Johnson, you should know these people don't play fair. They're already spinning the narrative. Fox News has a segment planned for tomorrow morning, questioning whether Justice Johnson provoked the stop. They're going to claim he was driving erratically, that he matched the description of a suspect. There was no erratic driving. Elijah interrupted, his voice stronger now, despite his exhaustion. There was no description. There was only a black man in an expensive car, and an officer who couldn't imagine that combination was legitimate. Keisha nodded. I know, I believe you. But they're going to fight this with everything they have. BPC has millions in funding. They have politicians on their payroll. They have judges. Judges. Elena's blood went cold. Judge Marcus Richardson, Millfield County Court. He's on record at BPC fundraisers. If your father's case goes before him, It won't, Elena said with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. We'll get a change of venue. We'll go federal if we have to. They're not going to bury this. Another knock. Dr. Chen again looking apologetic. I'm sorry, but there's a situation. Mayor Webb is downstairs demanding to see Justice Johnson, and there's a crowd gathering outside supporters and protesters. Security is overwhelmed. Elena looked at her father, a silent question passing between them. Let the mayor come, Elijah said quietly. And then, let's talk to the press. If they want a story, let's give them the truth. 20 minutes later, Mayor Richard Webb stood in the doorway, a man who'd clearly been interrupted in the middle of something more pleasant than a constitutional crisis. He was 50-ish, balding, with the kind of practiced smile that came from years of small-town politics. Justice Johnson, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am about what happened. Officer Sullivan has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I want to assure you that Millfield takes these matters with the utmost seriousness. Does it? Elijah's voice cut through the rehearsed apology. Mayor Webb, how many complaints has Officer Sullivan received during his tenure with your department? Webb's smile faltered. I'd have to check the exact number. 17, Elena provided. 17 complaints, 0 disciplinary actions. That's not seriousness, Mayor. That's complicity. Now, Ms. Johnson, I understand you're upset, but accusations like that aren't accusations when they're documented facts. Elena held up Keisha's folder. I have evidence that your police department receives funding from an organization that specifically recruits and protects officers with histories of misconduct. I have documentation showing that Officer Sullivan was hired after Pittsburgh PD terminated him for brutality. And I have 17 complaints, 17 separate incidents where citizens claimed misconduct that your department ignored. The mayor's face had gone pale. Where did you get that information? That's not the question you should be asking, Mayor. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Webb could answer, Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and felt her heart skip. The caller ID read White House switchboard. Excuse me, she said, stepping into the hallway. This is Elena Johnson. Ms. Johnson, please hold for the president. Elena's world tilted. She'd voted for President Michaels, had admired her commitment to criminal justice reform, but she'd never imagined speaking to her directly. Ms. Johnson. The president's voice was warm but concerned the accent of her native Texas, softening the formal words. I'm calling about your father. How is he? Stable, Madam President. Thank you for asking. I've seen the video. Elena, may I call you? Elena, what happened to Justice Johnson is unconscionable. I want you to know that the Department of Justice is prepared to open a civil rights investigation into the Millfield Police Department. I'm also sending the Attorney General personally to meet with your father and ensure he receives every protection and resource available. Elena's throat tightened. That means more than you know, Madam President. Your father is a good man, one of the finest legal minds in the country. And what he endured today, no one should experience that. No one. But especially not someone who's dedicated his life to upholding the Constitution. The president paused. Elena, I know your father. He's going to want to turn this into something bigger than himself. He's going to want to use this moment to create change. And I want you to know that when he does, he'll have the full support of this administration. Thank you, Madam President. One more thing. Tell your father that his colleagues on the court have been calling all evening. Chief Justice Reeves wanted me to convey that the entire court stands with him, and there's already talk of postponing the oral arguments on Daniels versus Chicago Police until he's recovered. Elena's mind raced. Daniels versus Chicago Police, the qualified immunity case that could reshape police accountability across the nation. The case where the court would decide whether officers could be sued for constitutional violations when they claimed they didn't know their actions were illegal. The most important police reform case in a generation, and her father was the swing vote. Madam President, I don't think my father will want postponement. A soft laugh. No, I don't imagine he will. Tell him to rest. Tell him to heal. And tell him the nation is watching, and we're ready for the conversation he's about to start. When Elena returned to the room, she found her father arguing with Dr. Chen. Absolutely not releasing you tonight, Justice Johnson. Your heart needs monitoring. You need rest. What I need is to go home, Elijah insisted. I will not spend another night in this hospital with police officers guarding my door like I'm a criminal. Daddy, you had 2 cardiac arrests. You need medical care. I'll have medical care at home. I'll hire private nurses if necessary, but I'm not staying here. His eyes were fierce, unyielding. Elena, they want me weak. They want me silent. They want me to hide away until this blows over. I won't do it. Dr. Chen looked helplessly at Elena, who understood what her father was really saying. Staying in the hospital meant accepting the victim role. It meant being passive, being protected, being reduced to the thing that had happened to him rather than the man who would respond to it. If he leaves against medical advice, Elena said slowly, and if he has round-the-clock nursing care, proper medication, and monitoring equipment. It's still a terrible idea, Dr. Chen finished. But I can't force him to stay. I'll need him to sign an AMA form. Draw it up, Elijah said. And then get me a phone. I need to call my law clerks. Daddy, it's almost 1 in the morning. They'll be awake. The entire country is awake. He was right. Elena could see it on the TV mounted in the corner of the room, muted but visible. Every channel was running the story. Justice Johnson's face, both his official Supreme Court portrait and the bloodied broken version from the video split-screened against footage of Officer Sullivan in his uniform. The chyrons scrolled past Supreme Court Justice brutalized by police. Justice Johnson stable after cardiac event. White House responds to Millfield incident. Nation demands answers. By 2 a.m. they'd assembled a plan. Elena would handle the legal response, filing complaints against Sullivan, demanding a federal investigation, preparing for the inevitable lawsuit. Marcus, arriving on the morning flight, would coordinate with their mother and handle family logistics. And Elijah, despite his daughter's protests, would return to his mother's house in Millfield and prepare for what he was already calling the reckoning. The discharge process took another hour, complicated by the police presence and the crowd outside. By the time they wheeled Elijah toward the exit, there were 200 people gathered in the parking lot, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Justice Johnson," others with Black Lives Matter placards, still others simply there to bear witness. And on the other side, separated by hospital security and local police, a smaller counter-protest. 50 or so people with thin blue line flags and signs reading, "Back the Blue and Sullivan did nothing wrong." Elena felt her father tense in the wheelchair as they emerged into the harsh glare of television lights. "Ms. Johnson, is your father pressing charges?" "Justice Johnson, do you have a statement? Will you be calling for Officer Sullivan's termination?" Elena started to wave them off, but her father's hand caught her wrist. "Let me speak," he said quietly. "Daddy, you need rest." "I need to use my voice while I still have it." He stood shaky but determined, and Elena saw reporters surge forward, cameras lifting microphones extended like offerings. Elijah Johnson. Supreme Court Justice stood in the fluorescent glare of a hospital parking lot at 3 a.m. and addressed a nation watching. "My name is Elijah Marcus Johnson." He began, his voice rough but clear. "I am an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. I am also a 72-year-old black man who was brutalized by a police officer for the crime of driving through my own hometown. I want to be very clear about what happened today. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a good officer having a bad day. This was racism, pure and simple, backed by a system that has protected and enabled that racism for generations." The crowd had gone silent. Even the counter-protesters were listening. "I chose not to reveal my identity during that stop. Some will say that was foolish. Some will say I brought this on myself. But I made that choice deliberately, because I wanted to experience what millions of Black Americans experience every day: the terror of being presumed guilty, the humiliation of being treated as less than human, the helplessness of knowing that the system meant to protect you sees you as the threat. A woman in the crowd was crying. Others were nodding their faces, reflecting recognition and pain. Tomorrow, I will be returning to Washington. I will resume my duties on the court. And I will be hearing arguments in Daniel's vows. Chicago Police, a case that will determine whether police officers can hide behind qualified immunity when they violate our constitutional rights. Some will say I should recuse myself, that I'm too close to this issue now, that I can't be impartial. He paused, and Elena saw the ghost of a smile cross his battered face. I have never been impartial about constitutional rights. I have never been neutral about justice. And I will not recuse myself from the most important civil rights case of this generation, because I finally experienced firsthand what I've been reading about in case files for 40 years. If anything, what happened to me today makes me more qualified, not less, to decide whether Americans deserve protection from the very people sworn to protect them. The applause started somewhere in the back of the crowd and rippled forward, building until it drowned out the reporters' questions and the counter-protesters' jeers. Elena helped her father back into the wheelchair, her heart simultaneously breaking and swelling with pride. They'd tried to destroy him. Instead, they'd given him a platform and a purpose that transcended anything he could have imagined. As they drove through the dark Pennsylvania night toward her grandmother's house, Elena's phone exploded with notifications. The video of her father's speech was already viral, 5 million views in 30 minutes. Twitter was on fire. #JusticeForJohnson was trending worldwide. But there was another notification too, buried among the supportive messages. An email from an address she didn't recognize with a subject line that made her blood freeze. You should have stayed in the hospital. She opened it with shaking hands. The message was brief. Your father thinks he's won. He thinks the video and the outrage will protect him. Tell him to be careful. Tell him that some systems defend themselves. Tell him that accidents happen especially to old men with bad hearts. The brave police coalition remembers its enemies. Elena deleted the email and immediately forwarded it to the FBI field office. Then she looked at her father dozing fitfully in the passenger seat and made a silent promise. They wanted a war. She'd give them one they'd never forget. The lawsuit hit the Millfield County Court like a bomb 3 days later. Elena filed it personally, standing in the clerk's office with a 300-page complaint that detailed not just Officer Ryan Sullivan's actions, but a pattern of constitutional violations stretching back 7 years. She named Sullivan. She named Chief Parker. She named the Millfield Police Department. And in a move that made the clerk's eyes widen, she named the Brave Police Coalition as a co-defendant, alleging conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law. This will destroy you, the clerk said quietly, an older black woman whose name tag read Dorothy Freeman. BPC doesn't lose. They have lawyers that make corporate firms look like public defenders. They have money. They have judges. So do we, Elena replied, sliding the complaint across the counter. File it. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she stamped the documents. Your father's a brave man. You are too. But bravery don't stop bullets, child. And these people, they're not playing at power. They have it. Elena met her eyes. Then it's time someone took it away. The news broke within an hour. Every major outlet picked it up. Justice Johnson sues police department and conservative coalition. The legal community erupted. Constitutional scholars debated the merits on cable news. Police unions issued statements calling the lawsuit a dangerous attack on law enforcement. And the Brave Police Coalition, in a press release that dripped with barely concealed threat, promised a vigorous defense against these baseless allegations. But it was the case assignment that made Elena's stomach drop. The randomized computer system that was supposed to ensure impartial distribution of cases had somehow placed Johnson v. Sullivan directly on the docket of Judge Marcus Richardson, Millfield County Court. The same judge Keisha Williams had identified as a BPC donor. Elena was on the phone before the ink dried on the assignment notice. "We need to file for recusal immediately. Richardson is compromised." Her co-counsel, James Chen, a veteran civil rights attorney from the ACLU, sounded doubtful. "On what grounds attending fundraisers isn't judicial misconduct? Half the judges in Pennsylvania go to political events." "This isn't political. BPC is a defendant. Richardson has financial ties to them." "That you can prove." Elena hesitated. Keisha's documents showed Richardson at BPC events, showed donations flowing from BPC-affiliated groups to his campaign fund, but the money trail was deliberately obscure, routed through PACs and non-profit organizations designed to hide the source. "I can prove enough to raise questions," she said finally. "Questions aren't grounds for recusal. You need evidence of direct financial benefit or personal bias. Otherwise, we're just going to piss him off before the trial even starts." Elena knew James was right, but every instinct screamed that letting Richardson hear this case was walking into a trap. "Then we go over his head. We file in federal court, claim federal question jurisdiction based on the civil rights violations." "Already thought of that. Problem is, your father was stopped by local police on a local road under state traffic laws. The federal civil rights claims are strong, but jurisdictionally, this is a state case first. We have to exhaust state remedies before federal courts will touch it. So we're stuck with Richardson. For now. But Elena, maybe that's not the worst thing. If Richardson shows bias, if he makes rulings that clearly favor BPC, we document everything and use it on appeal. Sometimes you have to let them hang themselves." Elena didn't like it, but she understood the strategy. The law moved slowly, methodically building records for appeals and reversals. Quick victories were rare. Justice was a marathon. She just hoped her father's heart could survive the race. The first hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, a preliminary conference to set the trial schedule and hear initial motions. Elena arrived at the Millfield County Courthouse 90 minutes early, her trial bag packed with documents, precedents, and the kind of righteous fury that had won her 17 civil rights cases in federal court. The courthouse was a pale stone building that aspired to grandeur but achieved only bureaucratic stolidity. Security was heavy metal detectors, bag searches, 4 uniformed officers where there should have been 2. Elena noticed the looks they gave her, the way their hands rested near their weapons, the suspicion in their eyes. She was the enemy now. The woman who'd sued their brother in blue. James met her in the hallway outside courtroom 3, along with 2 junior attorneys from his firm, and Keisha Williams, whose investigative reporting had become an unofficial part of their legal team. "Richardson's chambers leaked the motion schedule," James said without preamble. "BPC's lawyers are filing to dismiss on qualified immunity grounds. They're arguing that even if Sullivan did everything we claim, he's entitled to immunity because the law wasn't clearly established." Elena's jaw clenched. Qualified immunity. The legal doctrine that protected police officers from lawsuits, unless they violated clearly established constitutional rights. In practice, it meant that officers could brutalize citizens with impunity, unless there was a previous case with nearly identical facts where a court had ruled the conduct unconstitutional. It was a catch-22 that made accountability nearly impossible. "We have video evidence of assault, denial of medical care, and false arrest," Elena said. "If that's not clearly established, the law doesn't care about video, it cares about precedent. And BPC's lawyers will argue that the specific combination of factors, elderly black man, expensive car officer, claiming reasonable suspicion, hasn't been addressed by the Third Circuit. That's insane. That's qualified immunity." James looked tired, like he'd had this argument 1,000 times. "But here's the thing, your father's Supreme Court case, Daniels v. Chicago Police, is about this exact doctrine. If the court rules against qualified immunity, it changes everything, including this case. Which is why BPC is going to fight this twice as hard. Keisha interjected. I've been tracking their spending. They've pulled in 3 major law firms, spent over $2 million in the last 10 days. That's not defensive spending, that's scorched earth. Before Elena could respond, the courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff called them inside. Judge Marcus Richardson was a thin man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of face that looked permanently disapproving. He took the bench without ceremony, his eyes scanning the crowded courtroom, filled with reporters, activists, and curious citizens drawn by the spectacle of a Supreme Court justice suing a police department. Before we begin, Richardson set his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I want to address the elephant in the room. There have been suggestions, unfounded and frankly offensive suggestions, that I cannot be impartial in this matter. Let me be clear, I have no connection to any party in this case. I have no bias for or against Justice Johnson or Officer Sullivan. I will rule based on law and evidence, nothing more. The protest died in Elena's throat as Richardson's eyes found hers cold and challenging. Ms. Johnson, I assume you have nothing to add to that. It was a trap. If she challenged him now, she'd look like she was attacking a judge's integrity without evidence. If she stayed silent, she'd lose the chance to object on the record. Your Honor, she said carefully, the defense simply notes its concern and requests that all rulings be scrupulously documented to preserve the record for any potential appeals. Richardson's smile was thin. Oh, I assure you, Ms. Johnson, I am meticulous about the record. Now let's proceed to the motion to dismiss. BPC's lead attorney was a woman named Victoria Cross, a partner at one of Philadelphia's most prestigious firms. She stood with the practiced confidence of someone who'd never lost a case she cared about winning. Your Honor, this lawsuit is a publicity stunt masquerading as a civil rights case. The plaintiff is a powerful man who chose not to identify himself during a routine traffic stop, chose to escalate the encounter, and now seeks to use his position to punish an officer who was simply doing his job. Elena was on her feet instantly. Objection. That characterization is not supported by any evidence and is inflammatory. Overruled. Ms. Cross is presenting her argument. You'll have your turn, Ms. Johnson. Victoria continued smoothly. Officer Sullivan had reasonable suspicion to conduct the stop. The plaintiff was driving a vehicle that frankly seemed inconsistent with his appearance and the neighborhood. When asked to comply with lawful orders, the plaintiff became argumentative and physically resistant. That is a lie. The voice came from the gallery, and Elena turned to see a young woman standing, her phone held high. I recorded the whole thing. He never resisted. He asked for his medication, and your client ignored him. Richardson's gavel came down like a gunshot. Order one more outburst and I'll clear this courtroom. But the damage was done. Other voices rose in support, a wave of anger that Richardson couldn't quite suppress. Elena seized the moment. Your Honor, that young woman is correct. We have video evidence, multiple angles from multiple witnesses, showing that Justice Johnson never resisted, never became combative, and repeatedly asked for medical assistance that was denied. Officer Sullivan's version of events is contradicted by objective evidence. Video can be edited, Victoria said smoothly. It can be taken out of context. It doesn't show what happened before recording started, what the officer perceived as threatening behavior. What he perceived? Elena's voice rose despite her attempt at control. He perceived an elderly black man and assumed criminality. That's called racism, not reasonable suspicion. Richardson's gavel came down again. Ms. Johnson, you will control yourself or I will hold you in contempt. This is a court of law, not a political rally. James put a hand on Elena's arm, a silent warning. She took a breath, forcing herself back into lawyer mode instead of daughter mode. My apologies, Your Honor. The defense requests that the court review the video evidence before ruling on any motion to dismiss. The facts are not in dispute, they're documented on camera. Victoria jumped in before Richardson could respond. The facts as they relate to the lawsuit may be documented, But the qualified immunity analysis doesn't depend on what happened. It depends on whether the law was clearly established. And I have 17 cases from the Third Circuit showing that officers have immunity for traffic stops involving non-compliant suspects even when force is used. Justice Johnson was not non-compliant, Elena shot back. He answered every question, followed every command, and was assaulted anyway. He failed to identify himself as a Supreme Court justice, because he shouldn't have to. Constitutional rights don't depend on status or position. Richardson's gavel came down for the third time, harder now, threatening. Enough. Both of you sit down. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus. He paused, his eyes moving between the lawyers. I'm going to take the motion to dismiss under advisement. I'll review the video evidence and the case law and issue a ruling within 30 days. In the meantime, discovery will proceed. Both parties will exchange witness lists and documents by the end of the month. Elena felt her stomach sink. 30 days was an eternity in a case like this, time for BPC to pressure witnesses, hide evidence, build their defense. And Richardson's tone made it clear which way he was leaning. As they left the courtroom, Keisha pulled Elena aside. I need to show you something. Not here, somewhere private. They ended up at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse, tucked into a back booth where they couldn't be overheard. Keisha pulled out her laptop and opened a folder filled with photographs and documents. I've been following the money, she said quietly. BPC isn't just funding police departments. They're connected to a network of white nationalist organizations, militia groups, supremacist think tanks, organizations that have been flagged by the FBI as domestic terror threats. Elena's blood ran cold as she scrolled through the images. Photographs of BPC leadership at rallies with known extremists, financial records showing donations flowing between BPC and groups like the American Heritage Alliance and the Patriot Defense League. Email chains discussing strategic partnerships and mutual interests in preserving order. This is bigger than I thought, Elena whispered. It gets worse. Keisha clicked to another folder. 3 sitting judges in Pennsylvania have received campaign contributions from BPC-affiliated PACs. Richardson is one of them. Judge Carol Hendricks in Philadelphia is another. And the third... She pulled up a photograph that made Elena's heart stop. Federal Judge William Crane standing at a podium with a BPC banner behind him, speaking at their annual conference. Crane is hearing the federal civil rights cases against Pittsburgh PD, Elena said slowly. Cases involving officers that BPC represents. And he's ruled in favor of immunity in every single one. 12 cases, 12 dismissals, perfect record for the cops. Keisha's eyes were fierce. Elena, this isn't just corruption. It's a coordinated effort to make police accountability impossible. They've captured the courts. Elena's mind was racing, connecting dots, seeing the conspiracy spread out like a web. The Supreme Court case. Daniels v. Chicago Police. If the court upholds qualified immunity, then everything BPC has been building becomes bulletproof. Officers can brutalize citizens without consequence, and courts controlled by BPC-backed judges will dismiss every lawsuit. Keisha leaned forward. Your father isn't just fighting for himself. He's fighting the last battle that matters. If he loses, if the court rules for immunity, the whole system becomes unreachable. Then we make sure he wins. Elena's voice was steel. And we expose every connection, every dollar, every judge that's been bought. We bring down the whole network. That's going to make you a target. Elena thought about the threatening email, about the way Sullivan's fellow officers looked at her in the courthouse hallway, about the whispers and warnings that had followed her since filing the lawsuit. I'm already a target, she said quietly. Might as well earn it. The investigation consumed the next 2 weeks. Elena and Keisha worked 18-hour days tracing financial records, interviewing former BPC members who'd grown disillusioned, building a case within a case. James handled the formal discovery while Elena pursued the shadow conspiracy, the network of power and prejudice that propped up officers like Sullivan. They found witnesses, 3 other black citizens who'd been stopped by Sullivan, brutalized, and then charged with resisting arrest. Their cases had been dismissed or pled down their complaints against Sullivan, buried in departmental files that were conveniently lost or damaged. One witness, a man named David Carter, agreed to testify despite obvious fear. "He stopped me for matching a description," David told Elena, his voice shaking with remembered terror. "Said I looked like a robbery suspect. I'm 67 years old, weigh 140 pounds, and I was walking home from church. The suspect was 25 and 200 pounds. But I was black, and that was description enough." "What happened after he stopped you?" "He threw me against a wall, searched me, found nothing because there was nothing to find. Then he arrested me anyway for disorderly conduct. Said I'd been verbally abusive, which was a lie. I spent the night in jail. Lost my job because I missed my shift. And when I tried to file a complaint, they told me Sullivan's record was exemplary, and I must have been confused." Elena took detailed notes, her anger building. "Will you testify to this in court?" David hesitated. "Ms. Johnson, I'm scared. These people, they don't forget, and I'm just a retired postal worker. I don't have your father's protection." "You'll have mine," Elena promised. "And you'll have the truth on your side. That has to count for something." But 2 days before David was scheduled to give his deposition, he was hospitalized after a hit-and-run accident near his home. The driver was never found. The police classified it as an unfortunate accident, a tragic case of someone running a red light. David survived, but he was too terrified to testify. Elena couldn't blame him. Then came the evidence suppression. During discovery, Elena had requested Sullivan's complete personnel file, his training records, and all citizen complaints. What she received was a heavily redacted mess, entire pages blacked out complaint forms, with the accusations, removed training documents that were conveniently exempt from disclosure under a Pennsylvania law protecting police personnel records. She filed a motion to compel, arguing that the information was essential to proving a pattern of misconduct. Richardson denied it within 24 hours, ruling that Sullivan's privacy rights outweighed the relevance of the records. "This is obstruction," Elena fumed to James. "How are we supposed to prove systemic misconduct if they can hide every piece of evidence? We use what we have: the video, the medical records, the testimony from witnesses who were present. And we pray the jury isn't packed with cop sympathizers." But even the jury selection was compromised. Richardson ruled that the case would be heard by a jury drawn from Millfield County, a predominantly white conservative area where the police union had significant political influence. Elena's motion to move the trial to a more diverse venue was denied. Every ruling seemed designed to strangle their case before it could breathe. Evidence excluded. Witnesses intimidated. Procedures twisted to favor the defense. And through it all, Richardson maintained his pose of impartial judiciousness. His rulings technically defensible even as they systematically dismantled Elena's ability to prove her case. She was drowning in a system rigged against her, and she knew it. The breaking point came during a hearing on witness testimony. Elena had subpoenaed Officer Martinez, the young cop who'd been with Sullivan during the stop, the one who'd protested that her father needed medical help. Martinez had initially agreed to testify his conscience, apparently troubling him. But when he took the stand for his deposition, his story had changed completely. "Officer Martinez," Elena began, her voice carefully controlled. "You were present during the stop of Justice Johnson, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." Martinez wouldn't meet her eyes. "And in your initial statement to investigators, you said that Justice Johnson appeared to be in medical distress. Is that accurate?" I may have said that, but I was mistaken. The situation was chaotic, and I misread the signs." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "You told other officers at the scene that Ryan Sullivan was going to kill him. Do you remember saying that Victoria Cross stood immediately?" "Objection. Hearsay and irrelevant." "It goes to the officer's state of mind and the observable severity of the situation," Elena countered. Richardson barely looked up from his notes. "Sustained." Move on, Ms. Johnson. Elena gritted her teeth. Officer Martinez, did you or did you not express concern that the force being used was excessive? Martinez's jaw worked, and for a moment, Elena thought she saw the decent human being struggling beneath the uniform. I asked Ryan to ease up. But that was just caution, not because anything was wrong. Officer Sullivan was following proper protocols for subduing a resistant suspect. Justice Johnson was not resistant. He failed to comply immediately with commands. He complied with every command he told your partner. He had a heart condition and needed medication. You heard that, didn't you? I heard something about medication, yes. And Officer Sullivan ignored that plea for help, didn't he? Martinez's voice dropped to almost a whisper. He made a judgment call about officer safety. Officer safety... Elena couldn't contain her outrage. From a 72-year-old man having a heart attack. Richardson's gavel came down. Ms. Johnson, you will ask questions, not make speeches. One more outburst, and this deposition is over. Elena took a breath, forcing herself to focus. Officer Martinez, has anyone from the Millfield Police Department or the Brave Police Coalition spoken to you about your testimony? Martinez's face went pale. That's not... It's a yes or no question. Have you been contacted? My union representative spoke with me, yes. That's standard procedure. What did your representative say? Victoria was on her feet again. Objection, attorney-client privilege. He's not an attorney, Elena shot back. Union representatives have the same privilege under Pennsylvania law when advising members about legal matters. Richardson nodded. Sustained. The witness doesn't have to answer. Elena wanted to scream. Every avenue was blocked, every truth hidden behind legal technicalities designed to protect the system from scrutiny. When the deposition ended, Martinez fled the room like a man escaping prison. Elena gathered her files with shaking hands, her frustration threatening to boil over. James caught her in the hallway. We still have the video. We still have your father's testimony. That's enough. It's not enough. They're burying everything that proves this was systemic. Richardson is killing us, and we both know it. Then we appeal. We document every biased ruling, every denied motion, and we take it to the appellate court, which will take months, years, and by then the Supreme Court will have ruled on Daniels, and if they uphold immunity, none of this matters. James grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. Elena, listen to me. This is how they win, by making us give up, by making us believe the system is so broken that fighting is pointless. But we don't have the luxury of despair. Your father is counting on us. So is every person who's ever been brutalized by a cop who thought he was above the law. Elena felt tears sting her eyes but blinked them back. I don't know how to beat a system this corrupt. The same way your father's been doing it for 40 years. One case at a time, one truth at a time, until the weight of evidence becomes undeniable. That night, Elena sat in her father's hospital room. He'd been readmitted after his blood pressure spiked during a particularly stressful deposition and told him everything. The suppressed evidence, the intimidated witnesses, the judge who was clearly in BPC's pocket. Elijah listened without interrupting, his face grave. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Do you remember what I taught you about the law? He finally asked. You taught me a lot of things. I taught you that the law is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used to build or to destroy. And the people who wield it determine which. He shifted in the hospital bed, wincing at the pull of IV lines. Right now, BPC is using the law as a weapon. They're using procedure to strangle justice, using precedent to perpetuate injustice. But Elena, we have tools too. What tools? Richardson has blocked everything. Not everything. We still have the public, we still have the truth, and we still have Daniels v. Chicago Police. His eyes were fierce despite his exhaustion. The Supreme Court hears oral arguments in 3 weeks. If we can survive until then, If we can keep this case alive long enough for the court to rule on qualified immunity, everything changes. And if the court rules the wrong way, Elijah's smile was sad, then we'll have lost more than a case. We'll have lost the last check on police power. But I don't believe that's going to happen. I've spent 12 years on that court. I know my colleagues. I know how they think. And I know that when they see what happened to me, when they understand that qualified immunity can protect even this level of brutality, at least 5 of them will vote for change. You're the swing vote, Elena said quietly. I am. Which is why BPC is trying so hard to discredit me to make this case about me instead of about the system. If they can paint me as a difficult suspect who brought this on himself, they neutralize the impact of my experience. But if we can show the pattern, the network, the conspiracy to protect officers like Sullivan, he reached for her hand, then my story becomes everyone's story. And that changes everything. Elena squeezed his hand gently. Keisha's been tracking the connections between BPC and white nationalist groups. The evidence is damning. Then we need to get it into the record. Not just in our case, but in the public consciousness. If Richardson won't let us present it in court, we present it in the court of public opinion. That's risky. It could backfire, make us look like we're trying the case in the media. We are trying the case in the media, Elijah interrupted, because the legal system has been captured. Sometimes, Elena, you have to fight power with transparency. You have to drag the corruption into the light and trust that enough people care about justice to force change. He was right, and Elena knew it. The traditional path-file motions, trust the process, believe in the system wasn't working because the system was broken. But there was another path: expose the rot. Let the American people see how deep the corruption ran, and hope that public outrage could accomplish what legal procedure couldn't. It was dangerous. It was unprecedented. And it might be their only chance. I'll talk to Keisha, Elena said. We'll put together a comprehensive report, every connection, every dollar, every judge, and we'll release it all. Do it, Elijah said. And Elena, be careful. These people have already shown they're willing to hurt witnesses. They won't hesitate to hurt you. She thought about David Carter in the hospital, about the threatening email, about the cold eyes of officers watching her in the courthouse. I'm not afraid of them, Daddy. Then you're not paying attention. Fear is appropriate when dealing with people who've weaponized the justice system. His grip tightened on her hand. But don't let fear stop you. Let it make you careful. Let it make you smart. And then do what's right anyway. Elena left the hospital with a plan forming in her mind, a strategy that was equal parts legal warfare and guerrilla journalism. She called Keisha from the parking lot. How fast can you turn your investigation into a publishable story? Depends. How much detail do you want? Everything. Names, amounts, connections. I want the American people to understand exactly how BPC has corrupted the legal system to protect bad cops. Keisha was quiet for a moment. Elena, if I publish this, I'm burning bridges with law enforcement across the state. Sources will dry up. Departments will shut me out. My career as a police reporter will be over. I know what I'm asking. Good, because I'm in. This story needs to be told, consequences be damned. Give me a week. But they didn't have a week. 3 days later, as Elena was preparing for another hearing, her phone rang with news that made the world tilt. Keisha Williams had been in a car accident on Route 76. Her vehicle had been run off the road by an unidentified truck. She was in critical condition at Temple University Hospital, her laptop containing all her research on BPC missing from the crash scene. The police were calling it road rage. Elena knew better. Elena made it to Temple University Hospital in 2 hours, driving through Philadelphia traffic with the kind of reckless urgency that came from knowing someone you cared about was dying. She found Keisha in the ICU unconscious, her face a mass of bruises and bandages, machines breathing for her while doctors worked to reduce the swelling in her brain. She's critical but stable, the neurosurgeon told Elena, a weary man in blood-spattered scrubs. The next 48 hours will tell us if there's permanent damage. Right now, we wait. Elena stood at Keisha's bedside, looking at the broken body of a woman who'd committed the crime of telling the truth, and felt something inside her harden into diamond-sharp resolve. No more playing by rules that only protected the guilty. No more trusting a system designed to fail people like them. She called James from the hospital parking lot. Keisha's laptop is gone. Everything we had on BPC, the financial records, the connections to extremist groups, the evidence of judicial corruption, it's all on that laptop. Please tell me she had backups. I don't know. I can't exactly ask her right now. Elena's voice cracked despite her attempt at control. James, they tried to kill her. This wasn't road rage. This was attempted murder to suppress evidence. You don't know that. Yes, I do. And so do you. David Carter gets hit by a car. Keisha gets run off the road. How many accidents do there need to be before we call it what it is? James was quiet for a long moment. What do you want to do? I want to go to the FBI. I want to get federal protection for every witness. And I want to subpoena every communication BPC has had with Richardson Sullivan and anyone else involved in this conspiracy. On what grounds? We still don't have proof of direct coordination. Then we find it. Elena's voice rose, drawing looks from people in the parking lot. She lowered it to a fierce whisper. We tear apart every email, every phone record, every financial transaction until we can prove what we already know, that this is an organized effort to obstruct justice. That will take months. Your father's Supreme Court case is in 2 weeks. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible timelines pressing down. Then we work faster. We use what we have, and we pray it's enough. But what they had was surprisingly more than Elena expected. When she returned to her hotel room, she found an email waiting from an address she didn't recognize. Keisha. backup.secure@protonmail.com. The message was brief. If you're reading this, something went wrong. Everything is in the cloud. Password, Truth Has Consequences, 2025. Don't let them win. K. Elena's hands shook as she typed in the password. A folder opened containing gigabytes of documents, spreadsheets, photographs, and video files. Keisha had backed up everything, organized it meticulously, and created a dead man's switch that would release it if she didn't check in every 72 hours. Elena spent the night reading through the files, her horror growing with each new revelation. BPC wasn't just funding police departments. They were running a parallel justice system designed to make accountability impossible. The organization had spent $47 million over 5 years' money that went to campaign contributions for judges in 12 states, always routed through PACs and non-profit organizations to hide the source. Legal defense funds for officers accused of misconduct, ensuring they had resources that victims could never match. Training programs that taught officers how to write reports that justified force, how to claim fear for their safety, how to build narratives that protected them from liability. And most damning, direct financial support to white nationalist organizations that shared BPC's vision of law enforcement as a bulwark against demographic change and racial equality. The evidence was overwhelming. It was also completely inadmissible in court, obtained through investigative journalism rather than legal discovery, tainted by privacy concerns and hearsay rules that would keep it out of any trial. But the court of public opinion had different rules. Elena called a press conference for the next morning, sending invitations to every major news outlet with a simple subject line: The Conspiracy Behind Police Brutality, a complete exposé. She didn't clear it with, James didn't ask permission from anyone. Some decisions had to be made alone. The press conference was held in a bland hotel conference room that quickly filled beyond capacity with reporters, cameras, and curious observers, drawn by the promise of scandal. Elena stood at the podium with her father beside her. He'd checked himself out of the hospital against doctor's orders, determined to be present for this moment. Thank you all for coming. Elena began, her voice steady despite the cameras and the magnitude of what she was about to do. 2 weeks ago, my father, Supreme Court Justice Elijah Johnson, was brutalized by Officer Ryan Sullivan of the Millfield Police Department. What appeared to be an isolated incident of racial profiling and excessive force is actually part of a systematic conspiracy to shield police officers from accountability. She pulled up the first slide, a network diagram showing the connections between BPC Police Department's judges and extremist organizations. The Brave Police Coalition is not a benign advocacy group. It is a criminal enterprise designed to corrupt the justice system. Over the past 5 years, BPC has spent $47 million to capture courts, protect bad officers, and ensure that victims of police brutality have no recourse. The room erupted with questions, but Elena pressed on, showing slide after slide of damning evidence. Financial records showing payments from BPC to Judge Richardson's campaign. Emails between BPC leadership and white nationalist groups discussing strategic partnerships. Training materials that taught officers how to justify force after the fact. 3 days ago, Elena continued, her voice hardening. Investigative journalist Keisha Williams was run off the road while carrying evidence of this conspiracy. She's currently in a medically induced coma fighting for her life. Before that, a witness in our case was hit by a car. These aren't accidents. They're attempts to silence anyone who threatens to expose BPC's corruption. A reporter from CNN stood. Ms. Johnson, are you saying that BPC orchestrated attempted murders? I'm saying that violence follows their interests with suspicious regularity. I'm saying that witnesses get hurt, journalists get silenced, and BPC-funded officers always seem to escape consequences. You can call that coincidence if you want. I call it conspiracy. Another reporter. Do you have proof of direct orders from BPC to harm witnesses? Not yet. But the pattern is undeniable, and the evidence we've gathered shows an organization willing to corrupt the entire justice system to protect officers who brutalize citizens. Attempted murder seems well within their moral boundaries. Elijah leaned toward the microphone, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades on the bench. I want to be clear about something. This isn't about one bad cop. Officer Sullivan is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is a system that recruits, trains, funds, and protects officers who see their badge as permission to brutalize. A system that has corrupted courts to ensure that victims can never find justice, and a system that will resort to violence when exposure threatens their power. A Fox News reporter, skeptical and aggressive. Justice Johnson, some would say you're using your position to attack law enforcement because of a personal grievance. How do you respond to claims that this is all just revenge? Elijah's smile was cold. If seeking accountability for constitutional violations is revenge, then yes, I'm seeking revenge. But I prefer to call it justice. And I'd remind everyone that the only reason we're having this conversation is because I survived. How many others didn't? How many people were brutalized by BPC-protected officers and died without anyone caring, without anyone investigating, without anyone demanding answers? The press conference lasted 2 hours. By the time it ended, the story was everywhere, trending on social media, leading every news broadcast, sparking outrage across the political spectrum. Even conservatives who typically defended police were troubled by the evidence of corruption. The connection to white nationalist groups was particularly damaging, making it impossible for mainstream Republicans to defend BPC without seeming to endorse extremism. But the backlash was immediate and vicious. Within hours, BPC released a statement calling Elena's accusations defamatory lies from a desperate lawyer facing an unwinnable case. Police unions across the country condemned the press conference as an attack on all law enforcement. And anonymous threats flooded Elena's email and phone. Graphic descriptions of violence, promises that she'd end up like Keisha, warnings to drop the case or face consequences. Elena reported them all to the FBI, but she knew that reports didn't stop bullets. The real blow came that evening when Judge Richardson issued an emergency ruling sanctioning Elena for inflammatory public statements designed to prejudice potential jurors and interfere with the administration of justice. The sanctions included a $10,000 fine and a gag order prohibiting her from making any further public comments about the case. James called within minutes of the ruling. "Elena, what the hell were you thinking? You just gave Richardson grounds to hold you in contempt, maybe even disbar you. He was going to rule against us anyway. At least now the public knows why. The public doesn't decide cases judges and juries do, and you just poisoned the well so badly that Richardson can claim he has no choice but to dismiss based on your misconduct." Elena felt a flicker of doubt. "You think he'll dismiss? I think he'll do whatever BPC tells him to do, and you just gave him the perfect excuse." James sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "Look, I understand the impulse. I understand wanting to expose the corruption. But you're a lawyer, Elena. You know better than to try a case in the media. The case was already dead in his courtroom. At least now people understand why. People understanding doesn't help your father get justice." Elena wanted to argue, but she couldn't. James was right. She'd let emotion override judgment, let anger push her into a tactical mistake. The gag order meant she couldn't even defend herself, couldn't correct the narrative, as BPC's lawyers flooded the media with their version of events. She'd sacrificed her case for exposure. Now she had to hope it was worth it. The next few days were chaos. The FBI announced it was opening an investigation into BPC's activities, though they were careful to say it was preliminary and should not be construed as indicating wrongdoing. The Pennsylvania Attorney General, under pressure from the governor, launched a separate inquiry into judicial corruption, and 3 federal judges asked to recuse themselves from police brutality cases after their BPC connections were revealed. But Richardson refused to recuse himself, claiming that Elena's publicity stunt had been designed to force his removal and he wouldn't be bullied by baseless accusations. The case stayed on his docket, the trial date looming, and every day brought new restrictions and adverse rulings. Through it all, Elijah prepared for Washington. The Supreme Court would hear oral arguments in Daniels v. Chicago police in 1 week. And despite doctors' orders, despite Elena's protests, despite the very real threat to his safety, he was going back to work. "They want me to hide," he told Elena the night before he left for D.C. "They want me scared, compromised, too damaged to do my job. If I don't show up, they win without even having to fight. Daddy, there are credible threats against you. The FBI found online chatter about disrupting the court session, maybe even—" Elena couldn't finish the sentence. "Maybe even killing me." Elijah said it calmly, like discussing the weather. "Elena, I've been on the Supreme Court for 12 years. I've ruled on abortion, gun rights, immigration, voting rights. There have always been people who wanted me dead. The difference now is that I'm actually afraid, and I refuse to let fear dictate my decisions." Marcus, who'd flown in from Chicago, put a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, being brave doesn't mean being stupid. If the threat is real, the threat is always real for a black man in America, Supreme Court justice or not. Officer Sullivan proved that." Elijah's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm going to Washington. I'm going to hear arguments, and I'm going to rule on whether qualified immunity survives. That's my job, that's my duty, and that's how we win, by doing the work even when they try to stop us." The flight to Washington was tense, surrounded by federal marshals and security protocols that turned a simple trip into a military operation. Elena accompanied her father along with James and a team of lawyers, preparing for the oral arguments that would determine not just Daniels v. Chicago police, but potentially Elena's case as well. The Supreme Court building looked exactly as it always did. Marble columns, bronze doors, the words, "Equal justice under law," carved above the entrance. But the scene outside was anything but normal. Protesters lined the steps, separated into 2 camps by police barricades and heavy security. On one side, hundreds of people holding signs reading, "End qualified immunity," "Justice for Justice Johnson," and "Black Lives Matter." On the other, a smaller but louder group with thin blue line flags, back the blue signs, and at least a dozen people wearing shirts with BPC logos. What made Elena's blood run cold were the other people scattered among the pro-police protesters, men in tactical gear, some with visible weapons, others with the kind of hard eyes that suggested military or law enforcement training. They weren't there to protest. They were there to intimidate. The marshals hustled Elijah through a side entrance away from the crowds and the cameras. Inside the building, the atmosphere was different, hushed, reverent, the kind of quiet that came from centuries of accumulated legal gravitas. But there was tension too visible in the tight faces of the other justices' clerks, in the whispered conversations that stopped when Elijah appeared. Chief Justice Thomas Reeves met them in the corridor outside the robbing room. He was a dignified man in his late 60s, a constitutional originalist who'd clashed with Elijah on many cases, but had always maintained professional respect. "Elijah," Reeves said, his voice heavy with concern. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was run over by the criminal justice system," Elijah replied with dark humor. "But I'm here. I'm ready. We can postpone if you need more time." "No postponement. Daniels has waited long enough for justice. So has the country." Reeves nodded slowly. "There's been some discussion among the justices about whether you should recuse yourself from this case. Given what happened to you, some feel your impartiality might be compromised." Elena felt her father tense beside her. "Who's calling for recusal?" "Let me guess. Harrington and Webster." The Chief Justice didn't deny it. Justices Harrington and Webster were the court's most conservative members, both appointed by Republican presidents, both reliably pro-law enforcement in their rulings. "They believe your recent experience creates an appearance of bias," Reeves said carefully. "My recent experience gave me first-hand knowledge of exactly what we're deciding in this case," Elijah countered. "If anything, it makes me more qualified, not less. I've read hundreds of qualified immunity cases. I've parsed the legal arguments, analyzed the precedents. But now I understand what those dry legal concepts mean in the real world. I know what it feels like when an officer has absolute power and zero accountability." "I understand, but—" "Thomas, let me be very clear. I am not recusing myself. If Harrington and Webster want to force the issue, they can file a formal motion, and we can have that fight publicly. But I suspect they'd rather not explain to the American people why a Supreme Court justice who was brutalized by police should be barred from ruling on police accountability." Reeves sighed, a sound full of the weight of keeping 9 brilliant, stubborn people working together. "I'll convey your position. But Elijah, this case is already explosive. Your presence on the bench is going to make it more so. Please be careful." The robbing room was traditionally a place of calm preparation, where justices donned their black robes and set aside their personal identities to become instruments of the law. But today the tension was palpable. Justice Catherine Morrison, a moderate appointed by a Democratic president, gave Elijah a warm embrace. "We've been worried about you," she said softly. "What happened was unconscionable." "Thank you, Catherine. But today isn't about me. It's about Marcus Daniels and every other person who's been denied justice because officers hide behind immunity." Justice Samuel Harrington approached, his face carefully neutral. "Elijah, I hope you'll give serious consideration to recusal. This case deserves a court free from any appearance of personal bias. What it deserves, Sam, is a court willing to confront the reality of police violence instead of hiding behind legal abstractions." Elijah's voice was pleasant but firm. "I'm hearing this case. If you have concerns, file your motion." Harrington's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The other justices watched the exchange with varying degrees of discomfort, caught between constitutional principles and personal loyalty. At precisely 10 o'clock, the justices filed into the courtroom and took their seats. The chamber was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjoining rooms. Elena sat in the public gallery, her heart hammering as she watched her father take his place on the bench. Third from the right, his face composed, his eyes alert, despite the exhaustion she knew he was fighting. Chief Justice Reeves called the court to order. We will hear argument this morning in Case 23-1547, Daniels v. Chicago Police Department. Mr. Rothstein, you may proceed. David Rothstein, a veteran civil rights attorney, approached the lectern. Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, this case asks whether qualified immunity should shield police officers who violate clearly established constitutional rights. Marcus Daniels was beaten unconscious by Chicago police officers during a traffic stop. He suffered a broken jaw, fractured ribs, and permanent vision damage in his right eye. The officers claimed he was resisting arrest, though video evidence shows he never raised his hands against them. When Mr. Daniels attempted to sue for his injuries, the lower courts granted the officers qualified immunity, ruling that even if the force was excessive, the specific circumstances hadn't been addressed in prior cases. Justice Webster interrupted his Texas drawl, sharp with skepticism. Counsel, doesn't qualified immunity serve an important purpose? Police officers have to make split-second decisions in dangerous situations. Shouldn't we protect them from second-guessing by judges and juries who watch video in the calm safety of a courtroom? With respect, Justice Webster, qualified immunity doesn't protect split-second decisions. It protects constitutional violations. The question isn't whether the officers made a mistake, it's whether they violated Mr. Daniels's clearly established rights. And the answer, based on decades of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, is yes. Elijah leaned forward, his voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. Mr. Rothstein, help me understand something. The doctrine of qualified immunity was created by this court, not by Congress. We invented it to protect officers from frivolous lawsuits. But hasn't it evolved into something quite different? Hasn't it become a shield that protects even egregious violations of constitutional rights? Rothstein seized the opening. Absolutely, Justice Johnson. The doctrine has grown far beyond its original purpose. Officers now receive immunity even when they clearly violate the Constitution, simply because the exact combination of facts hasn't appeared in a prior case. It's created an impossible catch-22. Rights aren't clearly established until a court says they are. But courts can't say they're established if officers get immunity for violating them. The government's attorney, Solicitor General Patricia Huang, argued for maintaining qualified immunity, emphasizing the need to protect officers from liability. But her arguments felt hollow in the wake of what had happened to Elijah, and several justices pressed her hard on whether the doctrine had become too broad. Justice Morrison asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. General Huang, let's be specific. Justice Johnson was stopped for no apparent reason, violently arrested, despite committing no crime, denied medical care, despite begging for his medication, and nearly died as a result. Under qualified immunity, as currently applied, could those officers claim immunity? Huang hesitated, knowing the trap. That would depend on whether prior cases established yes or no. General, could they claim immunity? Potentially yes, if the specific facts hadn't been. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reeves gavelled for order, but the damage was done. The Solicitor General had just admitted that even the brutalization of a Supreme Court justice might not overcome qualified immunity. It was Elijah's turn to speak, and the courtroom fell silent. General Huang, I want to ask you a question that goes beyond legal doctrine. When power faces no consequence, can we still call it justice? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Huang opened her mouth, then closed it clearly, struggling for an answer that wouldn't concede the entire case. Justice Johnson Wyatt. The law provides remedies through criminal prosecution and internal discipline. Does it? Because I was brutalized by an officer with 17 prior complaints, all of which resulted in zero discipline. Criminal prosecution almost never happens. Internal investigations are designed to protect officers, not punish them. So I ask again, when power faces no consequence, when officers can violate constitutional rights without meaningful accountability, can we honestly call that justice? Elena watched from the gallery, tears streaming down her face, as her father turned his personal trauma into a philosophical challenge that struck at the foundation of qualified immunity. Before Huang could answer, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. Security officers moved quickly, hands on weapons, as someone shouted from the public gallery. Elena's heart stopped as she saw a man in tactical gear standing, his hand reaching inside his jacket. "Gun!" Someone screamed and chaos exploded. Marshals swarmed the bench covering the justices. Security tackled the man before he could draw whatever weapon he was carrying. People dove for cover, screams echoing off marble walls. Elena was pushed to the floor by a marshal, her view blocked by bodies and confusion. She heard her father's voice, calm despite the terror. "Everyone remain calm. Let security do their job." The man was dragged out, fighting and screaming about traitors and defending America. Two more people were removed from the gallery, one carrying what turned out to be a manifesto declaring that the Supreme Court had become an enemy of law and order and needed to be cleansed. The courtroom was cleared and swept for additional threats. It took 30 minutes to secure the building and determine there were no other attackers. When the justices returned to the bench, Elijah's hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was steady. "We will not be intimidated," he said simply. "We will not allow violence to dictate how we interpret the Constitution. Mr. Rothstein, please continue your argument." But the argument was essentially over. The attempted attack had made the stakes brutally clear. This wasn't just a legal question about police accountability. It was a flashpoint in a larger battle over power, justice, and who had the right to demand both. The oral arguments concluded at noon. The justices retreated to conference, while the nation held its breath, waiting for a decision that would reshape the relationship between police and the communities they served. Elena found her father in his chambers, surrounded by law clerks and security. He looked exhausted, older than his 72 years, but there was fire in his eyes. "They tried to kill you," Elena said, her voice shaking. "Right there in the Supreme Court. They tried to—" "They failed," Elijah interrupted gently. "And now we have even more proof that this system is broken. The man they arrested, he had a BPC membership card in his wallet. He'd been posting on their forums for months about defending officers from judicial tyranny. This is what we're fighting, Elena. An organization so corrupted by power that it inspires attempted murder." A knock at the door. Chief Justice Reeves entered, his face grave. "We need to talk about the conference. Given the security breach, some justices are suggesting we delay the decision." "No delays," Elijah said firmly. "We heard the arguments, we know the law, we vote." Reeves nodded slowly. "Then I need to know where you stand. This is going to be close, Elijah. Your vote will likely decide it." Elijah looked at Elena, then back at the Chief Justice. "I stand with the Constitution. I stand with accountability. And I stand with every person who's been brutalized by officers who thought their badge made them untouchable. Qualified immunity as currently applied violates the fundamental principle that no one is above the law. It has to end. Even if it means officers face more lawsuits. Even if some good cops get caught up in litigation. Good cops have nothing to fear from accountability," Elijah replied. "And bad cops have everything to fear from it. That's how it should be. That's how justice works." The conference lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the decision was 5-4 to substantially limit qualified immunity. Officers could still claim immunity for truly ambiguous situations, but clear violations of constitutional rights would no longer be shielded just because the exact factual scenario hadn't been litigated before. It was a compromise, not the complete abolition that reformers wanted, but it was seismic nonetheless. The Johnson Standard, as legal scholars would come to call it, shifted the burden of proof. Officers would have to show why they reasonably believed their conduct was lawful, rather than plaintiffs having to find a prior case with identical facts. The opinion would take weeks to write, with Elijah drafting the majority opinion and Justice Harrington writing a blistering dissent. But the vote was locked and the outcome certain. When Elena heard the news, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Her father's suffering hadn't been meaningless. His choice to experience powerlessness to endure brutality without the shield of his title had given him moral authority that transcended legal credentials. And that authority, combined with the undeniable evidence of BPC's corruption, had convinced enough justices that the status quo was untenable. They hadn't won the war. Richardson's court would still try to destroy their case. BPC would still fight with everything they had. And the threats, the violence, the systematic corruption wouldn't disappear overnight. But they'd won the battle that mattered most. They'd changed the law. And in doing so, they'd given every victim of police brutality a fighting chance at justice. That night, as father and daughter sat in his Georgetown apartment, surrounded by security, but finally able to breathe, Elijah raised a glass of water in a mock toast. "To the long arc of the moral universe," he said softly. "May we live long enough to see it bend," Elena replied. Outside, the protests continued. The threats multiplied. The forces of reaction gathered their strength for the next battle. But inside that room, two people who'd stared into the darkness and refused to blink allowed themselves a moment of quiet victory. The revolution wouldn't be televised. It would be litigated one case at a time until the weight of justice became undeniable. The quiet victory lasted exactly 12 hours. By morning, the backlash had begun. Police unions across America issued statements condemning the Supreme Court's preliminary vote warning of a chilling effect on law enforcement and predicting that officers would be too afraid to do their jobs. Conservative media called it judicial activism at its worst, with some commentators suggesting that Elijah's personal experience had compromised his judgment beyond repair. And the Brave Police Coalition, sensing existential threat, launched a media campaign that cost $7 million in its first week alone. But something unexpected happened too. The FBI's investigation, which had been proceeding at the glacial pace typical of federal bureaucracy, suddenly accelerated. The attempted attack on the Supreme Court had changed calculations in Washington. Attorney General Rebecca Martinez personally took charge, assigning her best prosecutors to what she called the most important civil rights investigation since the 1960s. And then, the dominoes began to fall. The first was Judge Marcus Richardson. An anonymous tip led FBI agents to a safety deposit box registered under his wife's maiden name, containing $200,000 in cash and detailed records of payments from BPC-affiliated organizations. When confronted with the evidence, Richardson's wife broke, immediately confirming that the money was payment for favorable rulings in cases where BPC had interests. Richardson was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning, led out in handcuffs, while cameras recorded every humiliating moment. Within hours, he'd resigned from the bench and agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony opened up new avenues of investigation, revealing a network of corruption that extended far beyond Millfield. Elena got the call while she was visiting Keisha in the hospital. The journalist had finally woken from her coma, her memory fragmented but slowly returning. When Elena told her about Richardson's arrest, Keisha's battered face managed a smile. "We did it," she whispered, her voice still weak from the breathing tube. "We actually did it." "You did it," Elena corrected. "Your investigation, your evidence, that's what made this possible." "And almost got me killed." Keisha touched the bandages on her head. "Was it worth it? Tell me honestly." Elena took her hand gently. "A corrupt judge is facing prison. BPC is under federal investigation. And my father's Supreme Court decision is going to change the law for every person who's ever been brutalized by a cop. So yes, Keisha, it was worth it. But I'm sorry you had to pay such a terrible price." "Somebody always pays," Keisha said softly. "At least this time the right people are paying too." With Richardson's recusal, Elena's case was reassigned to Judge Patricia Okafor, a federal judge with an impeccable record on civil rights. The change was immediate and dramatic. Okafor denied BPC's motion to dismiss within 48 hours, ruling that the evidence of Sullivan's conduct was sufficient to proceed to trial, and that qualified immunity did not apply given the clearly excessive force. More significantly, she granted Elena's motion to compel discovery, ordering the Millfield Police Department to turn over Sullivan's complete personnel file, all citizen complaints, and internal communications about the stop. The documents that arrived were devastating. 17 complaints, as Keisha had reported, but the details were even worse than Elena had imagined. Sullivan had a pattern of targeting Black and Latino drivers, using minor traffic violations as pretexts for searches and arrests. 3 formal internal investigations had recommended discipline, but Chief Parker had overruled them all, citing Sullivan's valuable contributions to public safety. The emails between Parker and BPC were smoking guns. "Ryan Sullivan is exactly the kind of officer we need more of," one BPC official had written. "Aggressive, uncompromising, willing to do what it takes to maintain order. We should protect him at all costs." Another email dated 3 days after Elijah's arrest. "The Johnson situation is a problem, but it's also an opportunity. If we can make this about his failure to comply, we turn a PR disaster into a teaching moment about respecting law enforcement." Elena read the emails with cold fury, each one confirming what she'd known, but couldn't prove that the brutalization of her father had been deliberate, systematic, and protected by a conspiracy that reached far beyond one small-town police department. The trial was scheduled for late November, but before it could begin, something extraordinary happened. Officer Ryan Sullivan requested a meeting with Elena and her legal team through an attorney who was conspicuously not affiliated with BPC. They met in a conference room at a downtown hotel. Sullivan, arriving with his new lawyer, a public defender, who'd taken his case pro bono after BPC abruptly withdrew their support. The officer who'd once radiated aggressive confidence looked diminished, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted. "Thank you for seeing me," Sullivan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve—" "You don't," Elena interrupted coldly. "So let's skip the apologies and get to why we're here." Sullivan's lawyer, a woman named Rachel Torres, spoke up. "My client wants to testify. Against BPC, against Chief Parker, against the entire system that trained and encouraged his behavior. He's willing to admit to everything: the excessive force, the false arrest, the denial of medical care. In exchange, we're asking that you consider a plea agreement that includes cooperation with federal investigators." Elena studied Sullivan, looking for signs of manipulation or deceit. Why now?" Sullivan met her eyes for the first time, and she saw something there she hadn't expected: genuine shame. "Because I almost killed a Supreme Court justice, and the people I thought were protecting me abandoned me the second it became inconvenient. BPC cut me loose 3 days after Richardson was arrested. No legal defense, no financial support, nothing. They told me I was on my own. And that's what changed your mind. Not the fact that you brutalized an innocent man, but that your friends abandoned you." "No." Sullivan's voice cracked. "What changed my mind was watching the video. Really watching it, not just skimming it for my report. I watched your father beg for his medication. I watched him tell me he had a heart condition. I watched myself ignore him, escalate the violence, justify it all in my head because I'd been trained to see black men as threats first and people second." He paused, his hands trembling. "Ms. Johnson, I grew up in a house where my father talked about those people like they were animals. I joined the police force because I wanted to protect my community, but somewhere along the way, I learned to see certain people as outside that community. BPC reinforced that. The training, the culture, the constant message that we were warriors in a war zone and anyone who didn't show immediate deference was the enemy." "That's not an excuse," Elena said flatly. "I know. There is no excuse. I did what I did and I have to live with that. But I can also tell the truth about how I got there, about the system that created officers like me and protected us when we crossed the line." Elena glanced at James, who'd been silent throughout the exchange. He gave a slight nod. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked. Rachel slid a folder across the table. "Complete cooperation with the federal investigation into BPC. My client has emails, recordings of training sessions, documentation of payoffs to officers who followed approved protocols for handling complaints. He can name names, trace money, explain how the system works from the inside. And in exchange, we plead guilty to assault and civil rights violations. We accept whatever sentence the judge deems appropriate. We waive all appeals, and we ask only that the court consider his cooperation as a mitigating factor." Elena wanted to say no, wanted to tell Sullivan that he deserved the maximum penalty, that cooperation didn't erase what he'd done, that her father had nearly died because of his racism and brutality. But she was also a lawyer who understood that bringing down BPC was bigger than punishing one officer. "I need to talk to my father," she said finally. "This is his decision, not mine." Elijah was back in Washington working on the majority opinion in Daniels versus Chicago Police, but he flew to Pennsylvania that evening. The meeting with Sullivan was brief and painful. The two men sitting across from each other in a prosecutor's office while federal agents recorded every word. "Why should I believe you?" Elijah asked, his voice carrying none of the warmth Elena was used to hearing. This was Justice Johnson, cold and analytical. "You shouldn't," Sullivan replied. "I lied about you. I brutalized you. I would have let you die rather than admit I was wrong. I'm not asking you to believe in my redemption, Justice Johnson. I'm just asking you to use me to take down the people who made sure officers like me never faced consequences. And you think testifying against BPC absolves you? No, nothing absolves me. But maybe it prevents the next officer from making the same mistakes. Maybe it saves the next innocent person from going through what you did." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Sullivan's face. "Tell me about the training. What exactly did BPC teach you?" For the next 2 hours, Sullivan detailed a system designed to maximize aggression and minimize accountability. Training sessions that taught officers to see every interaction as potentially lethal, to interpret any hesitation or question as resistance to write reports that justified force after the fact. He described workshops on tactical communication, how to give commands that were designed to confuse and escalate rather than de-escalate. He explained the informal networks where officers shared best practices for avoiding discipline, including how to claim fear for their safety, how to ensure witnesses were discredited, how to make complaints disappear. The federal prosecutors in the room were recording everything, occasionally interjecting questions that pushed Sullivan to be more specific, to name names, to document patterns. By the time the session ended, they had enough evidence to expand the investigation to include departments in 8 states. When it was over, Elijah stood slowly, his body still healing from the trauma. He looked at Sullivan with an expression Elena couldn't quite read, not forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Officer Sullivan, I accept your cooperation, but I want you to understand something. What you did to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the predictable result of a system built on racism and violence. Your testimony might help dismantle that system, but it doesn't change the fact that you participated in it willingly, even enthusiastically. You'll have to live with that." "I know, sir. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." "Then spend it well, because there are thousands of people who never got the chance to confront the officers who hurt them. They're dead or traumatized or simply gave up on justice. You owe them more than testimony. You owe them change." The federal trial of the Brave Police Coalition began in March in a Philadelphia courtroom packed with journalists, activists, and law enforcement officials watching their world collapse. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy to obstruct justice, wire fraud, and civil rights violations. 14 individuals were named as defendants, including BPC's executive director, 3 regional coordinators, and Judge Richardson. Sullivan testified for 6 days, his detailed account of BPC's operations painting a picture of systematic corruption that shocked even veteran court observers. He described how BPC recruited officers with histories of complaints, how they funneled money to departments that hired these officers, how they provided legal defense that was contingent on officers following approved narratives that protected the organization. But the most damaging testimony came from Richardson, whose cooperation agreement required him to detail every bribe, every fixed ruling, every case where he'd traded justice for cash. He identified 11 other judges who'd received payments, 3 prosecutors who'd deliberately undercharged officers in criminal cases, and dozens of police chiefs who'd participated in the conspiracy. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdicts came back guilty on almost every count. BPC's executive director received 18 years in federal prison. Richardson got 12, though his cooperation would likely reduce it. And the organization itself was dismantled. Its assets seized, its network shattered. The civil settlements followed quickly. Millfield agreed to pay Elijah $15 million and to implement comprehensive police reform, including body cameras, civilian oversight, and mandatory de-escalation training. Chief Parker resigned and was subsequently charged with obstruction of justice. 7 other officers were fired, their cases referred to federal prosecutors. But the real victory came in June when the Supreme Court officially released its opinion in Daniels v. Chicago Police. Justice Elijah Johnson's majority opinion was 63 pages of carefully reasoned legal analysis that fundamentally reshaped qualified immunity doctrine. The Johnson Standard, as it became known, held that officers could not claim immunity for actions that any reasonable officer would know violated constitutional rights, regardless of whether the exact scenario had been previously litigated. The opinion opened with words that would be quoted for generations. When power faces no consequence, we have abandoned justice for tyranny. When those sworn to protect us become immune from accountability, we have replaced the rule of law with the rule of force. The Constitution promises equal justice under law, not justice reserved for those with sufficient power to demand it. Elena read the opinion in her father's chambers, tears streaming down her face as she recognized his experience woven through the legal reasoning. He'd taken his pain and transformed it into precedent, his humiliation into hope for every person who'd been brutalized and told they had no recourse. "It's beautiful, Daddy," she said when she finished. "It's going to change everything." "It's going to change some things," Elijah corrected gently. "The law is only as good as the people who enforce it. We've given victims a weapon, but they still have to fight. The system will still resist. The culture will still protect bad officers. But at least now, when they fight, they have a chance." The impact was immediate. Within weeks, hundreds of cases that had been dismissed under qualified immunity were refiled. Victims who'd been told they had no standing suddenly found lawyers willing to take their cases. And police departments across America, facing potential liability for the first time in decades, began implementing reforms they'd resisted for years. It wasn't perfect. Some departments fought back. Some officers found new ways to evade accountability, and the Supreme Court's conservative minority promised to revisit the Johnson Standard at the first opportunity. But it was progress, real and tangible, bought with suffering, but resulting in change. In September, 9 months after that terrible afternoon on Riverside Drive, Millfield hosted a reconciliation ceremony in the town square. The event was Elena's idea, a chance for healing and acknowledgement for the community to confront what had happened and commit to doing better. Elijah almost didn't attend. The physical wounds had healed, but the psychological scars remained. Returning to Millfield meant confronting the place where he'd been brutalized, the streets where he'd lain bleeding while people watched and recorded. But Marcus convinced him, arguing that healing required presence, not absence. The square was transformed for the occasion. A stage had been erected decorated with flowers and photographs, not just of Elijah, but of the other victims of police violence, whose stories had emerged during the investigation. David Carter was there, recovered from his hit and run, ready to share his story. 3 other citizens stood with him, their experiences finally validated, their voices finally heard. The mayor of Millfield, elected in a special election after the previous mayor resigned, in disgrace, spoke first. "We failed Justice Johnson. We failed our citizens. We allowed a culture of brutality to flourish because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable truths about racism and power. Today, we acknowledge that failure, and we commit to ensuring it never happens again." The new police chief, a black woman named Sandra Williams, who'd been brought in from Seattle to reform the department, detailed the changes being implemented. Body cameras for all officers, mandatory bias training, civilian oversight boards with real authority, and a zero-tolerance policy for excessive force. Then Ryan Sullivan took the stage, and the crowd fell silent. He'd been sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for civil rights violations, but he'd been released on bail, pending his surrender date, to complete his cooperation with investigators. He stood at the podium in civilian clothes, looking smaller somehow, without the uniform and the gun and the power they represented. "My name is Ryan Sullivan," he began, his voice shaking. "9 months ago, I brutalized Justice Elijah Johnson. I stopped him for no reason except the color of his skin and my own prejudice. I ignored his pleas for help. I denied him medical care. I filed false charges against him. And I would have destroyed his life to protect my own reputation if the video hadn't made that impossible." He paused, his eyes finding Elijah in the front row. "I can't undo what I did. I can't give back the dignity I took or heal the trauma I caused. But I can tell the truth. I can admit that I was trained and encouraged by a system that valued control over justice, that saw certain communities as threats rather than citizens deserving protection. And I can use my experience to help dismantle that system." The crowd was restless anger and pain, visible on faces throughout the square. But Elena noticed something else too. People listening, really listening to an admission of guilt that was so rare in cases of police violence. Sullivan continued his testimony, becoming confession. "The Brave Police Coalition didn't make me racist. They didn't create my biases, but they gave me a framework that justified those biases, that turned prejudice into protocol. They taught me that aggression was strength, that questioning was disrespect, that admitting mistakes was weakness. And they promised that if I followed their model, I'd never face consequences." He looked out at the crowd, his face wet with tears. They were wrong, and I was wrong. And every officer who thinks the badge makes them immune from basic human decency is wrong. Justice Johnson could have died that day. And if he had, I would have written my report, claimed he was resistant and threatening, and BPC would have defended me. Another black man dead, another officer protected, another family destroyed. The silence was absolute now, the weight of those words settling over the square like falling snow. "I'm going to prison," Sullivan said quietly. "And I should. What I did was criminal. But before I go, I want to say this to every officer watching: you have a choice. You can be part of a system that brutalizes and lies and hides behind immunity, or you can be part of something better. You can protect and serve in truth, not just in slogan. You can admit when you're wrong. You can face consequences instead of hiding from them. That's what real courage looks like. Not the false bravery of violence, but the true strength of accountability." He stepped away from the microphone, and for a moment no one moved. Then David Carter stood and began to clap. Others joined a slow, complicated applause that acknowledged pain and possibility in equal measure. Elijah was the last speaker. He walked to the stage slowly, still favoring his left side, where the ribs had been bruised, still moving like a man who'd learned that his body was more fragile than his spirit. The crowd rose as he approached the podium, a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. When the applause finally faded, Elijah stood in silence, his eyes scanning the faces gathered in the square. He saw black and white, young and old supporters and skeptics, all of them waiting to hear what a Supreme Court justice, who'd been beaten on their streets, would say about justice and healing. "I came back to Millfield because this is where I'm from," he began, his voice carrying across the square without amplification. "This is where my mother raised me. Where I learned to ride a bike, played basketball in that park over there, had my first kiss under those oak trees. This town shaped me. And 9 months ago, this town almost killed me." The words hung heavy in the autumn air. I could have left and never returned. I could have let bitterness define my relationship with this place. But I chose to come back because I believe in something bigger than my pain. I believe that places like people can change. That communities can confront their failures and choose to do better. That reconciliation is possible, even necessary, if we're ever going to move forward. He paused, his eyes finding Sullivan in the crowd. "Officer Sullivan told you the truth today. That takes courage. But truth-telling is just the beginning. Real change requires action, sustained effort, the hard work of rebuilding trust that's been shattered. It requires white communities to confront the racism they've tolerated or ignored. It requires police departments to value de-escalation over domination. And it requires all of us to believe that every life, black, white, brown, has equal worth and deserves equal protection." An elderly white woman in the front row was crying openly. Beside her, a young black man held a sign reading, "Thank you, Justice Johnson." "Someone asked me recently if I regret not identifying myself during that traffic stop," Elijah continued. "If I regret choosing to experience what millions of black Americans experience without the privilege of a title to protect them." And the answer is no. I don't regret it. Because my silence gave me understanding. It showed me viscerally what I'd only known intellectually, that the criminal justice system treats people differently based on the color of their skin. That qualified immunity protects officers who brutalize. That the promise of equal justice under law is just that, a promise, not yet a reality. He placed both hands on the podium, leaning forward with the intensity that had defined his career on the bench. "But here's what I learned that gives me hope. The people who recorded what happened to me, they were horrified. The nurses who treated me, they were compassionate. The journalists who investigated, they were relentless. The prosecutors who charged the conspirators, they were determined. And the American people who watched that video, they were outraged. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to demand change. Enough to force a reckoning." He straightened his voice, growing stronger. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Martin Luther King said that. But what he didn't say, what he didn't need to say, because it was understood, is that the arc bends because we pull it. Justice doesn't happen on its own. It happens because people fight for it. Because victims refuse to be silent. Because allies refuse to be complicit. Because communities decide that the cost of change is less than the cost of continuing injustice." Elijah gestured to the photographs surrounding the stage faces of people who'd been victims of police violence in Millfield over the years. These people pulled the arc. They filed complaints that were ignored. They testified even when threatened. They demanded accountability, even when the system fought back. Some of them are here today. Others didn't live to see this moment. But their struggle, their suffering, their refusal to accept brutality as normal, that's what made this possible. He looked directly at the new police chief, at the mayor, at the citizens gathered in the square. "Millfield has a choice now. You can treat this ceremony as the end of an embarrassing chapter, a public relations exercise to restore your reputation. Or you can treat it as the beginning of real transformation. You can implement reforms that actually work, hire officers who value community over control, create oversight systems that have teeth. You can prove that small-town America can lead the way in reimagining what public safety looks like." His eyes found Elena in the crowd, and he smiled, a real smile full of love and pride. "My daughter taught me something during this ordeal. She taught me that sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to break it further, to expose the corruption so completely that rebuilding becomes the only option. The Brave Police Coalition is gone. Judge Richardson is going to prison. Officers who thought they were untouchable are facing consequences. The system that protected them has been dismantled." He paused, letting that truth settle. But dismantling the old system is only half the work. Building a new one, one that actually delivers on the promise of equal justice, that's the harder part. That's the work that will take years, maybe generations. But it's work worth doing. It's work we must do. Because if a Supreme Court justice can be brutalized with impunity, what chance does anyone else have? Elijah stepped back from the podium, and this time the applause was different, not celebratory but solemn, a collective commitment rather than congratulation. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Elijah saw something that made him stop and stare. A young black police officer, one of 4, hired as part of the department's reform efforts, was helping an elderly white woman across the square, his hand gentle on her elbow, his face patient as she moved slowly with her walker. The woman looked up at the officer and smiled. "Thank you, young man. You remind me of my grandson. He's training to be a police officer too." "Is that right?" the officer replied warmly. "Tell him the job's not about the gun or the badge. It's about serving, really serving. That's what they're teaching us now." Elena appeared at Elijah's side, following his gaze. "Is that what you hoped for, when you chose not to identify yourself?" "I didn't know what I hoped for," Elijah admitted. "I just knew the system was broken, and I needed to understand it from the inside. I needed to feel the powerlessness, the humiliation, the fear. Because how could I write opinions about police accountability if I'd never experienced what it felt like to be completely at an officer's mercy? And now, was it worth it?" Elijah watched the young officer help the elderly woman to a bench, watched them talk like human beings rather than adversaries. He thought about the Supreme Court opinion that would bear his name, the legal standard that would protect countless people from the brutality he'd endured. He thought about Sullivan's testimony that had brought down an organization that had corrupted the justice system for decades. He thought about the reforms being implemented, the conversations happening, the slow, painful movement towards something better. "Yes," he said finally. "It was worth it. Not because my suffering had value, suffering never does, but because we transformed that suffering into change. We took pain and made it purpose. We took brutality and made it a catalyst for justice." Elena linked her arm through his, and they walked together across the square, where he'd once played as a child, where he'd been brutalized as an old man, and where he now stood as a symbol of both the system's failure and its potential for redemption. "The arc of the moral universe is long," Elena said softly, quoting her father's words. Elijah completed the thought, but with an addition that felt earned by experience. "But it bends because we pull it, and sometimes the pulling breaks you. But if you're lucky, if you're strong, if you have people who love you and a cause worth fighting for, you heal. And the arc bends a little further, and the next person who comes along pulls it a little more. Until one day maybe justice isn't just a promise carved above a courthouse door. It's a reality that lives in every interaction between power and the people it's meant to serve." They left Millfield as the sun was setting, the town square emptying behind them, the work of transformation just beginning. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over because justice wasn't a destination, but a direction, something you moved toward without ever fully arriving. But they'd moved it. They'd pulled the arc. And in the pulling, they'd proven that even the most entrenched systems of power could be challenged, could be changed, could be brought to account. The road ahead was long. The opposition remained fierce, and the forces of reaction were already planning their counterattack, looking for ways to undermine the Johnson standard, to rebuild what had been torn down, to restore the immunity that had protected brutality for so long. But Elijah Johnson, Supreme Court Justice, brutalized citizen and architect of change, was ready for that fight. Because he'd learned something fundamental during those terrible minutes on Riverside Drive, that power without accountability was tyranny. That justice delayed was justice denied, and that sometimes the only way to change the system was to experience its failures so completely that silence became impossible. The arc bent because they pulled it, and they would keep pulling every day, in every case, in every moment, when power threatened to overwhelm justice, until the promise of equal protection under law became more than words on paper. It became the truth,